Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Let Loose podcast, the podcast dedicated to all things related to the Gym Leader Challenge format. I'm your host, Jeff Bache, and today we are joined by a super awesome co-host, someone who I stream with regularly during this Thursday night hour, the king of all cardboard. We've got Wheatr. Eric, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you doing tonight, Jeff? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, dude, it's a pleasure, man. And I know this is our normal time. This feels just like our normal stream, but instead of the added anxiety of course, throwing down cars and making good plays, we're just talking GLC, which is one of my favorite things to do. So thanks for being on. And of course,
Glad to be here.
yeah, we got to talk about it because, we just had a big tournament at the Cardboard Warriors, which of course you are in charge of. So we need to talk more about Cardboard Warriors since we got you on the stream. And Cardboard Warriors has been a big part of, my growth as a player in the Gym Leader Challenge community. It's basically what I feel like made me a great player, is playing with all the wonderful people that are part of that community, talking shop with them, discussing things in the Discord, looking at sweet deck list. Tell us more about Cardboard Warriors, man. Of course, the website's cardboardwarriors.net, but it's so much more than just a website. Tell us about it, man.
Yeah, Cardboard Warriors started out as just an idea to get online tournaments going. Back when I discovered GLC, I played a bunch of games with a guy named Adam, and I wanted to play in some tournaments. There weren't many at the time. There was maybe one a week, and I couldn't participate in it ever. So he and I were talking about it, and we decided to start some tournaments. And from there, it turned into let's run a big tournament every once in a while, and then we need a Discord to organize the big tournaments and have a place to play them. And so it just one thing led to another, and it became, I guess you could consider it a semi-competitively focused GLC hangout. It's really the Discord is the lifeblood of Cardboard Warriors, and I like to host tournaments and play GLC. That's really the whole point of it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
been lots of fun. Met lots of great people like you doing it, hosting the tournaments, and webcam games are always lots of fun, especially once PTCGO died, I thought, well, Cardboard Warriors is going to go down with it. People aren't going to play webcam. No one's going to talk about GLC anymore. But fortunately, we had a bit of a rally, and people adopted webcam, and so we're still going to this day. We're close to 1,000 people in the Discord, so it's come quite a long way.
Yeah. And just to piggyback off that, it's like a great community too. Like you mentioned the tournaments, but like one of my favorite things to do is just pop on there with a deck list idea. And you're getting like recommendations from some of the most skilled players to some of the people that play GLC more than anything. So beyond even just playing webcam matches, I can be like, hey, I got this idea for this really bad card. What do you guys think? And people will hop in there and help you optimize your bad decks. It's such a fun place. It's a very good community. I love everything about it. And again, it's a very important part of who I am right now is the Cardboard Warriors. I got the sweatshirt, of course. I got some shirts too that have the CBW logo on them. So big fan. So Wheatr, thank you again. I know you're a huge part of this community. I love having you on. GLC wouldn't be where it is today without a lot of the things that you and Cardboard Warriors are putting forward. So thank you.
It,
Cool. Well, that being said, you know, webcam is blowing up. So we've got this big tournament that just happened this last weekend. I think it was the first prized tournament in terms of like financial payouts since PTCGO had gone down. I know that there had been like first place and second place incentives for a couple of tournaments, but this was free entry with a $100 payout to the top four. And we have tournament results, I think, that are meaningful for the first time in a while. So 28 players came out to play GLC. We had some predictions going into it. Some of my predictions were right. Some of my predictions were wrong. But I think it was a success. So what do you think, Wheatr? Success on your part?
yeah, I thought I didn't get to play. I was judging, but I thought it was tons of fun, even just to hop in and watch the games. They all feel a little bit different when there's something on the line, and I think that was the first online tournament with an actual monetary prize pool, even including ATCGO. So people were invested, and GLC being what it is, people still brought their favorite decks for the most part. We only, everyone, most people would like to say that Turbo Snorlax is the best deck, or maybe Psychic, or whatever else, but we really didn't have too many of the same decks show up. There was tons of diversity, and so it led to some interesting results and some interesting decks popping up. But overall, I think we knew what the end result was going to be, and even though it was what you predicted, and probably most people thought, I still think it was a fun experiment. And honestly, I hope to have semi-regular prize tournaments like this. I think it keeps people engaged and is a fun outlet for really optimizing decks. So I would like to do it again soon, given the opportunity.
Yeah, and I would like to play, and didn't get a chance to play in this. Weekends are tough for me as a single dad on the weekends. I am married, but my wife works weekends, so I'm not able to participate in a lot of things that happen on the weekends. But hoping to maybe be available in some way, whether that's playing or commentating. So that'd be super sweet if I get that chance to kind of hop on and do some stuff with it in the future. And you mentioned kind of like the excitement around it. Like you could kind of like I felt kind of anxious going into it. Like I was excited because this was the first time we were going to see some like real competitive GLC on like a global stage in a while. Like we haven't had the full grip games, 1Ks. I think there was like a 2K in Augusta that I went to, but it didn't even feel quite as big as this because I think the 2K was only like 19 players. So, like it didn't feel as big as this tournament. So, seeing this, we hadn't had any meaningful results. Like, we didn't know what meta percentages there were going to be. And it was just exciting. And then we got all that data and we got it here. So, we're going to talk about what happened in this tournament, what kind of the most played deck were. We'll talk the top four, and then we'll look through some of the more notable, maybe interesting decks. I think we've picked three to kind of highlight outside of the top four. But here's our meta breakdown. So you look at it, Dark is at the top with 5 decks, and I think it was 5 different Dark decks. Like I don't think that there were actually 2 of the same Dark decks being played, which is really interesting. Like you would expect Turbo Guzzlord or Red Banquet. No, there were kind of a mixture of things going on, from Poison to Nido Queen and King. It was really cool to see some of these dark decks. They didn't perform super well. You can see their win percentage there is only 35% with a record of 7-13, but Dark was represented. We jumped to Lightning, which surprised me again as being one of the more popular types to be played. Psychic, you kind of expect, and Colorless also sitting there with 4. Colorless, of course, with a 72, close to 73% win percentage, just going 16-6 over the day. 5 rounds Swiss and then a cut to top 4. Ridiculous what Colorless was able to put up. Then you got Water at 3, Grass, Metal, Fire, all at 2, which I feel like is probably appropriate these days. I feel like Grass has maybe fallen a little bit down into the Metal and Fire tier when it comes to how it's represented. And then, of course, we got Fighting and Dragon there just at 1. One brave soul brought fighting to the tournament. So kudos to them. That was Mickey. Shout out. Hitmon Bros love. But that's the meta breakdown. Is that what you expected to see, Witter? 5 dark decks, 4 lightning decks? That did not seem
No.
like something I was expecting.
No, I would have, with real money on the line, I would have expected to see Psychic, Colorless, and Water at the top.
Mm-hmm.
They were close to the top, but I think Lightning really surprised me the most, especially making top 4. But like I mentioned before, it was a really good array of different types. I think every type was represented except for Fairy, which we can debate whether that's real type or not. Yeah, it was nice to see lots of different decks. And I think Mickey and Colorless were the only types that broke the 50% barrier. People like to say Psychic's the best deck in the format, and I think this result is pretty consistent with what we've seen throughout the history of Cardboard Warriors, which is that Psychic hovers right around 50%.
Yeah.
And Colorless, as we've seen since Snorlax was released, is completely dominant. Yes, I think it proved a lot of things that we expected to be true.
Yeah. And I think what's kind of notable here, more than even like the inclusions or the decks that did show up were some of the decks that were excluded or didn't pop up. And I know that this is a big talking point that a lot of people bring up in terms of how well colorless does, but we didn't see a traditional psychic list being played. We had a couple of psychic lost zone lists. I think there was even like a spread list in the mix, but there wasn't like a Tinkaton Gallade list that was being played, which people tend to look at as one of the better decks. So when people like, were debating whether or not colorless is the best deck in the format, that's usually the list again that people point to. So it not being here is, I don't know, kind of an issue for, I think, the results to a certain degree. And of course, the other deck that didn't make a showing either was what many people call whales, which is just special energy water, which I think most of us think has a pretty decent matchup into colorless. So the exclusion of these two decks, is that helping colorless on its way? Something to think about. We might have to wait till the summer championship to see if those two decks are really in the same competitive spectrum that colorless is.
Yeah, I'm like you. I do think those were glaring omissions from the deck lists that were submitted. They're definitely two of the strongest decks, without question. So, it's hard to say why that's the case. I don't think in online tournaments people have ever really played Tinkaton Gallade a lot. I'm still not sure why. I know Andrew Mahone thinks that's the very best deck, and being the flag bearer for GLC, the creator of the format, I would expect that more people would be playing that deck, since he's a very popular figure. So it's kind of surprising that that wasn't played. I do know we have a couple Whalelord players, special Whalelord players that have played from time to time in our tournaments, and they usually do very well. I know we had one, I think it was stick figure win a tournament a few months ago with it. When it shows up, it does normally do pretty well. So it would have been nice to see that in the field as well.
Yeah. So again, we'll wait till the summer to maybe declare Snorlax best deck in the format, even though I think we all kind of know it, at least to a certain degree. Those of us who play in Cardboard Warriors have kind of looked at colorless for a while and been like, huh, it's still there, huh? But to the point that you made, like, why is no one playing the Tinkaton Delayed list? It feels very solved, and I know a lot of the people in the GLC community are brewers. So when there's a deck list that seems close to perfect, it's kind of hard to be like, all right, what do I do to this list? Because when you get, and Z-Man mentioned this too, when you have a couple stage twos that are powerful attackers and support mons, you got a couple of basics, and then you have kind of this mesh of support Pokemon that you can use in certain situations. There's like a poetry to it. And it's hard to be like, what do I change? What do I personalize in this list when it already feels really
Mhm.
strong and powerful? So that's why I think a lot of people tend to play Psychic Lost Zone instead, which had a pretty good showing at this tournament too, is because there's like, 10 cards in that deck that you can just be like, hey, these are my pet preferences, and then they work out. So I think that's a big part of it. People love to play their pet cards. I mean, it's GLC.
Yeah, and I think there's a heavier bias in the online scene to bring your own deck. I don't, in my personal experience, whether it's at regionals or the few locals that I've been to, at locals there's more net decking. There's a much more consolidated meta. Most people are, and especially at regionals, most people are playing psychic water colorless grass, and that's pretty much it. And it's usually what they've seen online. So that may be personal experience, but from people I've talked to, it's somewhat consistent, especially across regional side events. Whereas online, like you said before, everyone likes to sit in the Discord and say, I want to include this card, and what do you think of my build? And then everyone chimes in until it's been optimized a little bit, and people feel like they can play this wacky deck that they really like.
Mhm.
So I guess we're seeing that reflected in the metagame as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to take the time to set up your webcam, spend a couple hours on a Sunday to play GLC, you're probably going to play your baby, right? Something you've worked on hard. So that makes a lot of sense too. Well, let's hop into these top four deck lists because they're pretty interesting. Like I called a couple, like thought that these decks were going to pop up. Of course, our first place deck list here. is not the colorless list I expected to see winning. And this is coming to us from our first place spring championship champion, Jeffrey Vanderveken. He's playing Porygon Z. This is 2024, and we're talking about Porygon Z Crazy Code Colorless. But man, Jeffrey is just one of the best players. So put him on a list of, the tournament registration list, and I'm just going to be like, yeah, he's winning. He's either winning or top fouring it, and that's what ended up happening. So here's his Porygon Z list. It's got some interesting includes. Obviously, it's playing Crazy Code Porygon Z, which has the Crazy Code ability, which is just a rain dance for special energy. It's got all the strong draw power that Colorless has to offer. The barrel, he's playing Dodrio as a draw engine and an attacker. And then he's got Cinccino because he's going to be digging for those energies because he needs them in hand so that he can attach them to his attackers. Then you've got, of course, Unfazed Fat Snorlax, just one of the strongest cards in GLC at the moment. Kangaskhan is a revenge attacker. Lugia, just all around great threat. Cyclizar, he's playing the Touring and Speed Attack Cyclizar, which hasn't been popular in other builds, but still pretty good because it has free retreat. And then his touch of spice is he is playing the Swellow that takes 2 prizes if it gets a knockout, and he's playing that in conjunction with Crisis Punch, as a way to take 2 prizes at the end of the game if he gets behind, because with 1 or 2 attachments, you can just power it up and go.
Yeah, very unique list from him. He's been playing this list. This is an evolution of his original Porygon Z list. So he's been playing this for a year,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. He used to play Dark every tournament, all tournaments, and he used to win a lot of them with Dark. And then he moved on to Colorless, and I think he used to play Slacking, the ability lock Slacking, and I was kind of surprised to not see that in here because it's such a threat by itself. But he's got his own flavor for sure with Kukui in here, which no one else plays, and it's cool to see Crisis Punch win a tournament. That's honestly a little bit hard for me to believe, but
Mm-hmm.
it's really cool that he won with that, and he's done a great job at evolving his list as new cards come out.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the thing I love most about what he's included in his list is that I think as GLC has kind of evolved throughout its short existence, the need for double prize turns as a comeback mechanic has increased. And we see that with some of the water lists, and we'll talk about one of them coming up that has the Articuno that takes 2 prizes, or the Starmie that can bench snipe. And so water has kind of evolved to that way to a certain degree. And so here it is in the first place colorless list. Like, you need to have a comeback mechanic, because if you're trading 1-for-1 on prizes and someone gets underneath you in the first couple turns, how do you come back? Inning someone down to 1 or 2 cards just really isn't enough anymore with the own card draw power that some decks have. So having a way to just be like, well, here's Swallow Crisis Punch, win the game from behind, is a good thing. And I think it's good for the format. If you're building your deck, strongly encourage you to include some way to have a comeback. Well, second place list was the list I thought I was going to win it all. This is Turbo Colorless, the list that has been rampaging the online scenes for a while now. So a lot of the same cards are going to be here. You got Snorlax, you got Lugia, you got Kangaskhan. You have Driving Buddy Cyclizar that does 70 plus 70 more if you've played a supporter that turn. So basically just 140 every turn. And then you're playing, instead of the Cinccino and the Dodrio, you've just got one of the most powerful draw engines. You're not going to have big hands with this, but you're going to see a lot of cards per turn. So you're playing Barrel with Instruct Oranguru, which draws up to 3. And then you're playing Squovit so that you can stash your cards on bottom of your deck, draw 1, and then you can draw more cards with those other 2 I just mentioned. Then there's a lot of room because you've got this basic base, and it's got 1 stage 1 in it too with Barrel, but you can play a lot of like tech cards too. So you've got Reset Stamp here to kind of disrupt your opponent. This list is playing Rhyme as a way to build that hand up and switch out your opponent's active, half an escape rope, draw 3 cards. You got Mallow because it works so well with your draw engine. Rotom Phone here because you're looking for strong top decks, and of course you can draw into it right away. Like, it's just kind of a crazy deck. Like, on the surface, you're like, how does this deck function? Then once you see it work, you're like, wow, he just drew 7 cards per turn. So this list is coming to us from Peche, and Peche went 5-2, and guess what? Her only 2 losses were to colorless, the other colorless deck.
For
So,
what?
So pretty amazing. So this is the list. It did well.
Yeah, it did well. It's a tried and true list. You know, its main weakness is something like ability lock, and it's interesting to see that Jeffrey was able to beat it twice, even without slacking. I think slacking is probably the best, maybe not the best, but a great answer to the draw engine. Because if this deck can't draw with its abilities, it can have trouble finding the tools it needs. You know, it plays some I think Silent Lab is one of the best answers to this list, but it plays so many answers for that with like Chaotic Swell, Field Blower, its own stadiums. This deck, I've looked at it way too many times. I test against it on my own a lot because if you can't beat this deck 40% of the time, then your deck probably won't do very well competitively.
Mm.
And you know, I like the competitive angle, so I've tested against this deck a lot. It looks really funky, but it always finds it. Always finds the answer somehow.
Surprised it got second place. That's like the big surprise. Like, am I surprised it's in the top four? No, I'm surprised it didn't win it all.
Agreed. And one thing that I think maybe gave Jeffrey the leg up is you mentioned the decks need to have a two prize mechanic now. Well, this deck doesn't have it. So it relies on probably taking the first knockout, which it's very good at. If it does fall behind and it can't disrupt the opponent well enough, then that's when it loses. So I think what Jeffrey had going for him is Swellow can take out the Squovit no problem. I think that's the best answer for this deck. You can't really rely on ability lock fully. And in my experience playing against it, you need something like what you mentioned, Rapid Strike Starmie, Quello perhaps. You need amazing rare Raikou, Guzzlord. You need some two prize mechanic in your deck if you will really want to stand a chance against this list outside of just a best of one. So Jeffrey having that, I think, probably proved to be very effective, honestly.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, and Jeffrey's just put in hours and hours and hours of playtime with his deck too. So he's going to know the ins and outs of that list like no one else too. So I'm chalk it up to a lot of professionalism on his part and just, pro skill. I mean, he's won so many things. He's used to winning. Um, so I think that he's probably tested this matchup a ton and he knows the ins and outs of what to do to take down Turbo Snorlax. Well, third place and fourth place list here. Now, before the tournament started, I did say I thought Turbo Colorless was going to be in the top four. And another deck that I said was going to do well was Psychic Lost Zone. I also said that no spread lists were going to be in there. At least that was what I thought would happen. And of course, what happens, fourth place list here, is a spread list. It's proven me wrong so hard. It's even written in the Discord for anyone who wants to go back and chide me a little bit. I deserve it. I deserve it. But this third place list coming to us from Draco Nova, a pretty standard Lost Zone list. We talked about Psychic on our episode last week with Z-Man on stream. But, you have Sableye that has Lost Mine. You got to have 10 cards in the Lost Zone pile in order for Sableye to put 12 damage counters wherever it would like. In order to do that, you're running some cards to help facilitate putting cards into the Lost Zone. Cards like Comfy, whose Flower Select looks at the top two, one in hand, one in Lost Zone. You've got Chorus's Experiment, draw 5, put 2 of them into the Lost Zone, 3 into your hand. And then you've got Banette here, which basically sacrifices itself to the Lost Zone in order to get you a supporter back from your discard. Besides that, you've just got a couple consistency pieces. You've got Meowstick that when it evolves can let you search for 2 supporters in your deck because Chorus Experiment is so important to what the deck is trying to do. Mars Shadow to help you draw cards. Mewtwo, which when you play it down, grabs a supporter from your discard and puts it back on top of your deck because you're really all in on Chorus Experiment again. You've got Meleota here as a spread attacker to help you kind of set numbers right as you're preparing to put cards in the Lost Zone. Gengar as a way to do the same thing. It can place damage counters, kind of put up a wall while you're getting set up. Mimikyu, which copycats, gets rid of things like Snorlax because Snorlax doesn't let damage counters be placed on it because, why not put the best ability in one of the best Pokemon ever? Well, who knows? And then, of course, one of the newer additions to these deck lists is the Memories of Don Mew, which just copies an attack of one of your basics. So Mew gives you a second Sableye, so you can just have your Sableye safely sitting on the bench while you're using its attack with this Mew. So a very strong and powerful deck. It churns through cards with Pokestop engine, basically a lot of items here that draw you cards or look at cards. And then I think they only play like 8 or 9 supporters, so this is not a very supporter heavy build, and it doesn't need it. It's just very powerful.
Very strong list, and I think when it appeared 2 Novembers ago, I believe is when it popped up, it just destroyed everyone online for so long. I'm not surprised to see it at the top. There are a lot of players that play online that play Lost Zone, and historically have done very well with it. So I think this is an interesting version of it with enhanced hammer, counter catcher, red card. So maybe some tech cards to help against colorless. It's interesting to see those inclusions.
Again, I think that if Snorlax didn't exist, we would probably be complaining more about this deck and how consistent it can be, even still in a singleton format. I guess fortunately, Snorlax exists. Maybe that's what, because I don't know. This deck can be oppressive too. We have to tell people at our locals to stop playing it sometimes because we want to play our fun decks. Same thing with Snorlax.
Yeah. The worst part about this deck is what people have cut from it, which is Chimecho, and so not seeing it when I'm playing against Lost Zone, of course, if it gets the turn to 10 in Lost Zone, that's brutal, and that's a pop off. Most decks have a pop off like that, but Chimecho really turns it into an anti-fun matchup sometimes. So if people have been cutting it, that's fine by me. I think it makes the deck easier to beat. So personally, I like seeing a version like this, but uh, yeah, not can be a not fun deck to play against. It's so good.
Yeah. And the Chimecho we're talking about is the Bell of Silence Chimecho. So 1 energy, it does 10 damage, and then you can't play a Pokemon with abilities during the next turn, basics or evolution. So it can be tough for a lot of different decks, especially if it happens on turn 1 going second. Then you just can't play, Drizzile to evolve or Grottle to evolve, and your grass and water decks aren't doing a whole bunch. So it can be oppressive in that way. I've seen other lists running the Auspicious Tone Chimecho, which is just 1 energy, go get a supporter card from your deck. That one's fine. It's the Bell of Silence Chimecho. And people, again, like you said, people are like, this card's fine. I've never had an issue with it. Someone brought up, like, you just play Nest Ball or Evo Soda. And I'm like, cool, I'm glad I could have exactly those 2 cards in my hand on the second turn of the game without any Pokemon with abilities. And
Yeah, I
I'm good.
remember. I remember watching in a team league. We had a team league in Cardboard Warriors, maybe a year ago at this point. But this list was around and still very popular, and the guy who made it was on my team, and so we would get in the Discord together and watch games. And I watched him beat grass and water over and over again by putting Chimecho in the active, looping Colress, and then, when all you have on the bench is a Snom and Octillery and Sobble, Sableye can clean things up pretty quickly. So it's crazy to me that people don't include it, but that's where we are.
Yep, yep. Fourth place list, but I think is probably my favorite list of the tournament. Like, obviously, I love kind of the spectrum of where things were at, because there are a lot of diverse decks in this format. But 2 Lightning lists kind of came out of nowhere, and this is a card I wasn't very high on, and now that I've seen it do well, I'm kind of want to play it. So kudos to the 2 people that played Lightning. The one who got fourth place is Evan Wiki. May it be Metagross is his name. Rotom Collector is another name I know him by. He's a man of many names, but we'll call him Evan Wiki for now. But he's playing this Lightning spread list, and it's just so sick. So it's playing the new Raichu that for 2 energy puts 50 damage counters on things that already have damage counters on them. Then you are also playing the Electivire, which for 3 energy also does 50 damage, but just to your opponent. So you've got 2 Pokemon that for relatively easy to manage attack cost can do 50 damage to everything. So pretty strong. You're playing cards like there's this Minim that for 1 energy does 10 damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon. You're playing the Tapu Koko that for double colorless energy does 20 to everything. So you've got cheap early spreaders. You've got Zapdos, which is the donk ruler of the format. 1 energy can do upwards of 80. And then you've got your 2 Dynamotors to kind of power things up. If those cards weren't good enough by themselves, you've got more Pico here, who has the Torment ability, or Torment attack, I should say. 1 energy, it does 20 to the active, and they can't use an attack, so it's a good stall mechanic. And then the second attack, I think, does 50 to the active, and then 20 to something on the bench, so you can kind of use it as a spreader too if you need to. And then you'll see that this list has opted to play a couple of basics without abilities that you would normally see in a list. Like normally you see Fluffy Pillow Mareep, but this list is playing greens to kind of help it have some explosive starts. So it's opted to forego that card, which I love, but I get why you wouldn't play it. Greens is a very powerful card too. It's just good. Like I didn't expect to see this list, and I didn't expect to see this list top 4.
Definitely. And it's nice to see people play spread. I think it's underplayed. I, like you, wasn't high on the Raichu, but I've seen it on Ricky Jim stream dominating against Metal, and which surprised me. And to get 4th place in a 28-player tournament says kind of a lot about the card. I'll let the results speak for themselves, and I think I got to change my tune on that card. I'd be happy to try it out. It's interesting to see, spread decks like to go behind, or maybe they don't like to, but they have to because they're not taking single knockouts at a time. So cards like Counter Gain, Counter Catcher are really nice includes in a deck like this because you have a much higher potential to trap an opponent and then spread a bunch of damage. So really cool to see the counter cards being played.
Yeah. And if they're dead cards in your hand, it doesn't matter too much in lightning builds because you just sprint them away with Zebstrika's ability. So you're never having dead hands because just throw them away and go on. These decks just discard cards left and right. I think this is maybe where my mental block is with this Raichu, is because I am a spread player. So I just immediately assume that other people are also going to play spread. But every time I show up to a place, I'm always the only spread player. So like maybe that's my issue. Is I'm just like, oh yeah, someone else is going to be playing it. Well, I'm the guy. I'm the guy who should be playing it. So that means that if I'm playing it, no one else is. It's funny because I think one of Evan's losses was to the mirror. I think that he lost the lightning mirror, so that maybe the Raichu did cook him.
Uh, that's got to be tricky. That's got to be tough to navigate.
Well, outside of the top 4, there were some pretty fun decks to talk about, and I don't have them up on screen, but we're just going to talk real briefly about what they're doing. You can check out the tournament results if you're interested. I'll probably put the link in the description of this, either on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're listening to this. But you can check them out on play.limitless.tcg, and you can see the results of the tournament. And you can click on all the deck lists and click through the cards. It's a really cool and useful website. So if you haven't tried it out, go check it out. But these are 3 decks that I thought outside of the top 4 we should probably talk about. And we got to talk about my first co-host on the podcast list, Bat Squid. Bat Squid was playing Nido Dark, which of course has Nidoqueen and Nidoking. And we talked about the Nidoqueen in our second episode as kind of a counter to some of the top decks, because the Nidoqueen, if you attach 2 energy to it, does 90 to the active, and then it can't be damaged by basics. So Bat Squid was going out here on a limb saying, I'm going to see a lot of colorless. Colorless is only playing basic attackers. If I can get Nidoqueen set up, I'm almost guaranteed to win the game. Unfortunately, he ran into the only fighting player of the tournament in his first round, Hitmon Bros, and without a bench barrier, he was cooked. He was cooked from the start. And once you get into that 0-1 bracket, you're not playing against Snorlax because Snorlax has a 73% win rate. It's not going to be in those bottom tiers. So he's probably ended up playing against some other decks that were playing evolution Pokemon, which I think Nido Dark is probably going to have a harder time against. You're definitely planning to see something, and he missed out on it. So sad. So didn't do as well as he'd like, but I do think it was the correct meta call. Just a little bit of bad luck at the beginning.
And it's a travesty that Nidoqueen and Nidoking are weak to fighting.
Yes,
That's
that too is
that's a shame.
brutal. It's kind of funny because
I,
fighting does have the best like weakness spread in terms of lightning, dark, and most colorless mons are weak to it, but it just can't ever be consistent enough to be a real threat in the meta.
Right. And you mentioned something interesting is that the players or the decks rather at the lower tables probably were playing more evolution Pokemon. So it it's just an interesting side note about what that says about GLC.
Yeah,
That big basic decks are pretty good.
yeah. And let's be honest, that's always been the case in the Pokemon TCG. I mean, Haymaker is the first iconic deck, going back all the way to base set. So big basics always been a part. Sometimes we wish it wasn't the way. I think that's why a reason why a lot of us love GLC is that we can play air quotes our evolution Pokemon. But obviously, there's still going to be best decks out there that have Snorlax and Kangaskhan and Lugias as their attackers. Uh, and we'll have to deal with that and manage them. Second deck I have up here, and I had to do a lot of reading before I could talk about this on the podcast, is Subject, the judge who shows up on my stream and always tells me that I'm wrong, which I love. So, Subject, keep telling me I'm wrong when you show up to my streams. He played a very interesting dragon deck, and it's a welder dragon deck. So he's playing a lot of fire energy. I had to read so many of these cards. He ended up going 2-3, which isn't the strongest showing, but the fact that he could go 2-3 with this list, I think, is pretty impressive. And it looks like there's something in this shell. So it has the Haxorus, which attaches, I think, a metal and a fire from the discard to it. And then for each basic energy attached, it does 40 more damage. He's playing that with the Hydreigon that can attach a dark energy to one of your dragon Pokemon. So you could just, attach 3 energy to this Haxorus in one turn. And since it only counts basics, it's doing damage like that. And they had another interesting card. It was the Zygarde. I can't remember the attack cost of it, but it did, X amount of damage for each prize card your opponent had taken. So these are kind of like the less sung about players of the dragon community. Obviously, he still has Garchomp in his list. He still has Dragonite Fast Call, but he's got some of these other cards that you just don't see very often.
Well, actually, an interesting exclusion that I've brought up to him before is he does not play Garchomp.
Oh, okay. I was wrong.
He
Redaction.
plays Gabite, but no Garchomp. So
Ah,
I think it's something about the energy cost since he doesn't really play fighting attackers.
okay.
But yeah, which means it's a very, very unique deck. He really likes to cook his own food. So it's cool to see. I was rooting him on while watching because I think he had a 2-0 start. So it was cool to see him at the top for a little while and playing this crazy dragon build.
Yeah, I really wish I could have seen that one in action. Did not get a chance. I also saw him at 2-0 and was rooting for him. But sadly, not his day towards the latter stages of the tournament. The last list that we're going to talk about here is one of my favorites. We have Leonardo here, someone who's a big deck builder in the community. I think Ursa Luna has been credited to him. He's got a great mind for control decks, but he's playing his version of Fishy's Jump, which is a hydro pump rain dance rapid strike starmie build. It's just it's like water box. You just have all these powerful cards that have kind of some synergies with each other, mostly the fact that they all need water energies to attack. But you can just kind of change what you're doing. You don't have to be all in on something. Obviously, you do need an accelerant. So he's playing both Baxcalibur and he's also playing Frostmoth as ways to attach energy. But then he's just got, he's playing the Whale Lord that has the Hydro Pump attack with 200 HP as a way to break down big Pokemon and also to have a wall keeping him safe while he takes maybe 2 prizes with it. He's playing CRZ Kyogre, which is one of the most busted cards in the format. Rapid Strike Starmie as a way to take multiple prizes and snipe your opponent's key bench Pokemon if it comes down to it. And then, of course, that Articuno that I talked about earlier that can take 2 prizes. So it's just a deck that can attack you in a lot of different ways. It turns out that he ran into colorless, and I actually think that Fishy's Jump has a pretty good matchup into colorless, but he bricked. And Peche was just able to take control of that game. I think he got 2 or 3 prizes pretty early, getting rid of the Starmie, getting rid of some other key mons, and then Leonardo could just not really come back based on what his draws were.
Yeah, and Leo's a great player. He won, our very first big tournament back when Amazing Rare Kyogre was around. I think there were 40 or 50 players in that one, and it was a Kyogre Mirrors in the final, and he ended up winning. But so a great player, and like you said, makes a lot of great decks. This version of Water has been around for quite some time now, and it's interesting to see how it's evolved. It's more or less the same. I think it might be Whale's Jump now with Wailord in there,
Hmm.
but that may be even a colorless tech to deal with Snorlax and have a big body up there. But yeah, this deck is so much fun to play. Highly recommend to anybody that likes fun decks because this one can do lots of things, lots of big turns and uh, lots of fun to play.
Yep. Yep, this is the list that similar list to this, not this exact list. I was playing Veluza over the Wailord line, but I took this to Async League semifinals and had a lot of fun with it. Fell short to Hitmon Bros, but that's life. But it's a super fun list, like you were mentioning. I love it so much. The Starmie, just whenever you get a chance to attach like 6 or 7 energy to a Pokemon and like machine gun down your opponent's board, it's just so fun for you, and it's not for them, but it's so fun for you to do it. And I just love that feeling. So I'm going to keep Rapid Strike Starming for a long time.
So, question for you: if you were to play against Hitmonbros today, would you rather have Palooza or Wailord?
Um, that's a good question. In all honesty, if I was playing against Hitmon Bros, I think having Veluza might actually be nice just because having the energy shoot back to something, like you could obviously stagger how you bench something. I think having the energy shoot back is kind of important. That's one of the reasons why I was playing it. Is like if you bench it at the right time, you can attach to it pretty safely. Obviously, Silent Lab turns it off, so there is going to be a moment where they might have Silent Lab and get rid of Manaphy's ability and Veluza's. So now that I'm talking about Silent Lab, maybe I would rather have Wailord. You know what? Take all that back. Play the Wailord. I would play the Wailord. Don't want to
Yeah,
get got by that
good
Silent
card.
Lab.
Good card.
Well, that's the tournament. It was super fun. 28 players again, $100 prize payout, colorless on top, some cool decks. Some people trying to obviously prepare for what they thought the meta might be. Maybe it wasn't that way. Again, 5 dark decks was a lot. Colorless showing in at a strong 4 with a 72% win rate. Again, what big takeaways do you have from this tournament, Weeder? Like, if there's 3 things that we learned from one of the biggest GLC tournaments in a while, what do you got?
Oh, number one, I think we confirmed Snorlax's strength.
Mhm.
That's for sure. Number two, and probably the most important one to me, is that when it comes to GLC, people like to play what they like to play. It's not, in standard, you've got 25% of a metagame is a Charizard deck. We are fortunate not to have that, where people like to play unique decks. They like to stylize things a lot, even when there's money on the line. So I think that's what makes GLC great. And number three is I think I was reminded how much fun the big tournaments are. 3 round tournaments are great. It's nice to get in a quick tournament and get some reps in, but a tournament with 5 rounds of Swiss and then the top four, it's fun to watch those games and see how the tournament progresses as the rounds go on. I like watching that.
Yeah, great takeaways. Nothing to add. Well, all right. Done with the tournament talk. It's time to get into the fun stuff. Today, we're talking all the F's in GLC. So we've got fighting, fire, and fairy. And we are, as you know, in GLC, F is for fun. So we're going to be talking about 3 types that maybe are a little bit more challenging to play. I don't want to say they're bad because like they've put up results. At least fighting and fire have. Well, we don't maybe need to include fairy in some of the same conversations that we need to include fighting and fire in. Bad is just it's such a hard word because fighting is just off the asynchronous championship league. You've won with fire before. We've seen other people win with fire. The only fire badge at Full Grip Games has gone down to the extreme speed deck. So like these decks are putting up results. It's just not as easy as some of the other types, and we're going to kind of talk about what that is. Weeder, do you have any thoughts before we get started talking specific cards like Fighting, Fairy, and Fire? What are your thoughts on them, and where do they place in the meta right now?
I will say that uh, colloquially, these are the worst types. I think that's the general sentiment of the GLC community at large. But I think we need to look a little bit deeper, inspect a little bit further, because I don't think that's necessarily accurate when you are playing the right kind of deck.
Hmm.
Now, Fairy, there's not much we can do about Fairy. There's no coming back for Fairy.
Nope.
But Fighting and Fire deserve. I think the bottom line to me is they deserve a little bit more respect than they currently get.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And obviously, I'm a fighting enjoyer. Hearing it from me maybe isn't the best, but I do think that Fighting and Fire both have their place, can both win you tournaments. And I think they might just be like one or two printings away from being like some of the most broken decks of the format. Like they have a lot of cool tools. It just needs something. And we'll talk about what that something is as we get into these cards. So we're going to start with Fighting because I produce the podcast, so I get to make sure things happen in the way I want to. So Fighting first is what I said. And we've got the most broken fighting Pokemon, in my opinion, is Machamp. Because Machamp's not only broken because it's a powerful card, it has the Crisis Muscles ability that says that if your opponent has 3 or fewer prizes, it gets another 150 HP, putting it at 300, which is a ridiculous number. 300 HP is absurd. On top of that, for 2 energy, it does 100, but it can do 100 more. You just have to not attack next turn. So it's a strong late game attacker with huge HP. And then on top of that, you got to look at it stage 1 because this stage 1 is one of the best support Pokemon that fighting has, and that's Daunting Pose Machoke, which is super bench barrier. It prevents damage to the bench, damage counters on the bench, and this is not only from attacks but also abilities. So it is an amazing stage 1 Pokemon that then evolves into an amazing stage 2 attacker. It's absurd.
Great cards. Where would Fighting be without the Machamp line?
In the garbage. In the garbage.
Would Fairy have a chance against Fighting if it didn't have Machamp?
No, it would still lose to
Yeah.
Hitmon
Okay.
Bros. Yeah. On top of that, some pretty good Dynamotor Pokemon here. We've got their stage 2s, which if you're looking at Lightning, Lightning has some stage 1, so it's not a good equivalent. But you've got Colossal here, whose Tar Jenner ability allows it to grab a Fire and a Fighting from the discard pile and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you want. So it is a stage 2, but you do get 2 energy on top of that. So it's pretty good. There are a couple of fighting Pokemon. I'm thinking specifically of like Hisuian Arcanine that gets a little boost for some fire energy. And there are a lot of good fighting Pokemon that have fighting, colorless attack costs. So that fire energy is not much of a cost to put into your deck. Then we've got a newer printing, Garganackle, here with Energizing Rock Salt. Basically, you get 1 energy from your discard pile, but you also get to heal 30 damage. So it's kind of an added bonus in there. Recently, people have been playing these 2 cards together, which I think adds a lot of consistency to builds that are playing them. But just powerful Dynamotor effects on some pretty beefy Pokemon that are hard to take down.
Yeah, at busted abilities. I think them being on stage 2s holds them back a little bit, but great cards.
Yeah. All right. Moving to my favorite trio of Hitmon bros. You got Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, Hitmontop, all with 1 energy attacks, all with 1 energy retreat cost, and they all have to sequence into the next one in order to then use their attack. So you start with Hitmonchan, hit and run is 30 and switch to the bench. Special combo is your next attack from Hitmonlee. It does 90 to the bench Pokemon for just 1 energy. And then you can finish off your loop with Hitmontop, which is finishing combo, which does 60 to everything. So this is one of the better, again, attack combos in the game, I think. It can be hard to pull off, but super fun when it does. And it can be devastating because it forces people not to bench certain cards at certain times, which can be a form of disruption that fighting doesn't have in other ways.
And the ability to run the full combo with 1 energy per Pokemon is also fantastic. This is one of the decks I've played against the most in GLC, which is probably surprising, but playing this deck well is nothing short of an art form. I have a lot of respect for Hitmon Bros players. Just blindly going for the combo every turn is not the answer. Sometimes you're attacking with Hitmonchan several turns in a row. Sometimes there's a good reason to interrupt the combo. You really have to understand the board state, what your opponent can do, and what your options are. So I have the nothing but the utmost respect for Hitmon Bros players.
Oh yeah. When you pull off the combo, it is a thing of beauty. And then sometimes there are games when your Hitmonlee is prized or your Hitmonchan is prized, and you're like, well, you know what? Thank goodness we've got Machamp. So again, like you said, there's a lot of nuance in playing this specific type of deck, and you always have to play fighting with the thought, "Hey, it's fighting. I've got to give it my best shot." It's not going to always happen. Sometimes it's out of my control, but man, when it does happen, so good. Well, speaking of one energy attackers, we got two of the better ones here, recent printings as well. Fighting's got a lot of good attackers. You'll probably notice that is a trend. You'll probably also notice the lack of support Pokemon. But you've got Annihilate here. It is a stage 2, but for one energy, it does 70 times the prize cards your opponents have taken. And its second attack is no slouch either 2 energy, and it does 170. It does damage itself for 50. It's a little squishy with 140 HP, but this is like your Whale Lord killer and your Torterra killer, which, fighting can have trouble with those two cards specifically, especially if you're playing like a Hitmon Bros build. But just having Rage Fist as like a backup plan, like, oh, hey, yeah, there's a Whale Lord out there. Well, I'm just going to do 240 damage because you've taken 6 prizes. We're good. All right, pretty good. And then the other attacker here is Lucario with the Avenging Knuckle ability, which if your fighting Pokemon was knocked out, it does 120 plus 30. So 150 for a revenge attack that only costs 1 energy on a stage 1 is a pretty good rate. So I really enjoy playing this card in a lot of my fighting builds. I think it's pretty good. Its second attack rarely gets used. 120 for 3. Like, you're never putting 3 energy on Lucario. It's not happening. All right. And the last little bit here, I say last bit, I think we got maybe one card to talk about that I'll never play in fighting, but these 3 here we will talk about, and I do enjoy playing them, is you got some ancient printings. You got the new Great Tusk with Thrasful Charge. It does 80 plus 80 more if your Pokemon have damage counters on them. It costs 3 energy, so it works out pretty well in a Colossal build. Then you've got Slitherwing, which is an interesting card. I thought this card was super bad at first, but the more I've played with it, the more I've come to like it. You attach 2 energy to it. It does 120 and it burns, so effectively 140. And then it does do 90 damage to itself, so it leaves itself with 50 HP, which is pretty easy to KO on the backswing. And then if you do attack again with it, it KOs itself. So it's kind of a risky card to play, but fighting does need an early KO taker, and that's what Slitherwing has kind of filled in terms of roles. Then, since they're ancient Pokemon, and there's not a lot of good ancient Pokemon to play in Gym Leader Challenge, this is really the only type that I think has any effective way to take this card and use it. It's Professor Seta's Vitality, which is choose 2 ancient Pokemon, attach a basic energy to each of them, and then if you did attach an energy, you draw 3 cards. And fighting was crying out for an energy attachment that also drew you a card. Like, it was already playing Raihan, that's conditional. Now you've got Seta's Vitality, which is pretty useful, but it's also got the condition of playing it in an ancient package.
And I think in a vacuum, it's a great card. If they attaching 2 energy in 1 turn and drawing 3 cards is pretty crazy, and especially given I think we have 2 other cards that attach an energy and do something else, and they're both of those supporter cards are knockout conditional. So if they ever print any more fighting ancient Pokemon, watch out. It could be scary.
Well, there is a third one, Sandy Shocks, but that card's so bad. People are trying to play it. Kudos to them for trying it. Like, maybe it fits somewhere, and again, I would love to be proven wrong. I just look at that Sandy Shocks and I'm like, it's not good enough ever.
Yeah, it doesn't seem appealing, but I have seen it pop up in a potential Okie dokie build. So who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I'd love to see it do well, because I do think Sandy Shocks is a pretty sweet card, or at least a pretty sweet mon. The card itself needs some help. Well, the last card I want to talk about is a pretty polarizing card. It is Ancient Power Archeops. And it is a fossil Pokemon. And we talked last week with Z Man about how fossil Pokemon have become a lot more difficult to put into play with the banning of Pokemon Research Lab. And this Archeops took a little bit of a hit, so it hasn't really seen a lot of play recently. Not that fighting sees a lot of play anyway. But this Pokemon's ability doesn't let either player evolve his or her Pokemon from their hand. So it used to be pretty easy to get out, and now it's just become so much more difficult because fighting isn't finding the cards it needs at the right times.
Right, and this may be one of those cards that makes people glad that fighting doesn't have great draw support, because if it did, if the heavens opened up and Mahone made Claydol legal, the old, I forget what set it's from, but the old Claydol that lets you stash 2 cards to the bottom of your deck and draw up to 6, I think we would have a lot of very problematic Archeops decks. Could be it's an anti-fun card, but given how much trouble fighting has, I personally don't have any problem when somebody plays this card. I mean, I tried it in Hitmon Bros. It was, left a little bit to be desired, but yeah, I think this one would be on the chopping block if fighting ever got some big draw support.
Yeah. I would trade this card for Claydol in a minute. So if you give me Claydol and we ban this card, I'm good. We're down. Mahone, you hear it? We're doing it. We're doing it, Mahone. But anyway, one of the other issues with this card, like obviously with the clay doll that you mentioned, there is a plume fossil, which like lets you put cards on if it's on the bottom of your deck. I think you can put it into play. So with that clay doll, that card becomes a lot more useful. Um, Archeops here is a stage 1 too, which is really weird because the other Archeops printing in colorless is a stage 2. So this Archeops actually can't be rare candied into, which is a really weird interaction and makes it so much more difficult to get out because you have to evolve into Arcan, which is also a stage 1. So you're evolving that stage 1 into this stage 1. And because this Archeops again doesn't have the stage 2 text, rare candy just doesn't work, and it just makes for a bad card, really.
Does make it very difficult to use,
Yeah. But people play it
thankfully.
with Devolution TM. You were playing it with Devolution TM. So when it happens, like you're playing the Hitmon loop, you're spreading damage to the board, you have Archeops in play, and you go for the Devolution play. Like it can be fun for you, not fun for your opponent. But no, how often does it really happen? All right, 3 decks that we're going to talk about in fighting, which I think it's hard to find road decks in fighting because there are the decks that people play, and then there are the decks that just seem unplayable. So with all the other types so far that we've talked about, we've gone like these are the decks you'll see, and then here's some other decks that are kind of fun. Well, with fighting, here are the decks you'll see. All right, and then anything else I don't know if is even playable. But we've got Hitmons, and we're going to show Castella's list off. Again, it has that combo that we talked about. Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, Hitmontop doing their little thing by comboing into each other's attacks to do devastating damage to the board. Typically, the rule is if you pull off the combo once, you're in a good position. If you pull it off twice, you win the game. He's playing Halucha here to help put damage counters. A lot of bench barriers like Mr. Mime and Manaphy have 70 HP. So you have to play Silent Lab, which turns off basic abilities to get around bench barriers, and Halucha lets you hit that 70 number. So Halucha is really key, and it can kind of pick up KOs on its own. So I think Halucha is a huge piece. Halucha, when you play it, puts 1 damage counter on 2 different things. So Halucha, I think, is one of the better pieces. And if your Hitmon Bros list isn't playing Halucha, I think you're wrong, but I could also be wrong. I like the card a lot. On top of that, you're playing the Busted Machamp and you're playing Revenge Lucario. And then you're just trying to play cards that either search for things or that also do something and draw. So you'll see like Bird Keeper be ever present cards in Hitmon list because you do need to switch out to achieve your combo, but you also just need to draw cards. You'll see a lot of KO search cards like Rosa, Teammates, or Raihan. Castella's playing all 3 here because again, your Hitmons are pretty squishy with only having 90 or 100 HP, so you're going to lose them often. So having these cards to help you go and get other cards is going to be pretty key. So that's Hitmons in a nutshell. Leader, what are your thoughts on Hitmons?
It's a hard deck to play. There's really not a lot of room for error.
Mhm.
If you miss sequence, you can be in a world of hurt. But it does have the feeling of being able to find exactly the right card on the right turn a lot of the time. But you really have to know what you're doing in order to pull that off. Team Magma Great Ball is an interesting inclusion that I think has popped up recently, which adds some needed energy search. This deck kind of struggles with energy search, at least in my experience.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's probably fighting's best deck. Maybe Organical could vie for that title, but I think this one is the most successful in tournaments. So if you would like to play fighting, I recommend you copying this list.
Yeah.
It just won the Async Season 2 League, the whole thing. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Kudos. This is the deck list I lost to, so wanted to put it on display. It is a super awesome list. Castella is a great player. Now, there are games like that you just don't get the combo off and you kind of have to navigate them, but when it does happen, it is great. And the best Hitmon players are doing their thing. Like if you know how to pilot the deck, you're going to do well. So if you're getting discouraged after a couple games, just keep putting the work in. You'll get there. You're going to feel like you're working harder than your opponent every single game, even if it's like a good matchup. Like you're playing Dark, which I think Dark is the best matchup because they're weak to fighting. Even the Flyer, even Crobat is weak to fighting for whatever reason. Galarian Moltres does have resistance, but everything else you can just like KO basically in one or two hits. So it's just going to feel hard. You're going to be stressed out thinking about your lines. But once you get it down, it's going to be smooth and you're going to be winning games and it will be great. Give it a chance. All right, next list. Got a shout out to my baby here, Garganackle. Not going to take all the credit for it. I had a lot of help in building it and obviously had a lot of ideas from other people that kind of came together for this list. So this is a community built list. Again, it's got my name on it because I can put it there. But other people, again, have contributed a lot to what this list became. So I really like this list. It's got Colossal and it's got the Garganackle, which that gives it its name, the Garganackle. And there used to be Colossal lists that just weren't consistent because if you prized any part of your stage 2 or if rare candy was gone or you couldn't get Colossal set up, you were just kind of dead in the water because all of your Pokemon's energy costs were 3 and you just never had the time to attach. And there was really no other form of consistent energy acceleration outside of that. So when Garganackle got printed, it really gave this archetype a boost because now you had options. It wasn't that Garganackle is the same thing as Colossal, but you could navigate a tricky spot without Colossal. And that's what happened. And so you've also got Groudon getting printed, and Groudon is absurd. So Swelling Power, its first attack, attaches energy from hand, which is a big help when your other two Dynamotors are down. And then its Magma Purge attack can do up to 240 damage. You just have to discard fire and fighting or whatever energy you have to do 60 times the amount you discarded. And the great thing about Groudon here is you don't have to discard it off the Groudon. You can actually discard it off a couple of your other Pokemon to help increase its damage. So you can keep your Groudon attacking for a couple turns by leaving the energy attached to it and kind of discard from other things to hit those KOs if you need to. Then to help with that, you're playing BRS Lucario with a Roaring Resolve ability, which searches up a fighting from your deck, attaches to it, and puts 2 damage counters on it. And then that Roaring Resolve Lucario then synergizes really well with Great Tusk, who needs a Pokemon with damage counters on it to do 80 more damage. So it's a deck of synergies. And then on top of that, you're playing the Great Tusk that's an ancient. You've got Slitherwing that's an ancient. So you can play Professor Seta's Vitality as another way to power up Pokemon. Then you can put Pokemon on your bench and energy on your bench Pokemon. You can use Groudon to attack. It's just got all these great synergies going on. And then in a pinch, you just have Arcanine, which can do 160 and burn. You've got Terrakion, which can basically gain immunity after an attack. So you've just got kind of these great basics, these 2 great Dynamotors that if you get them set up, just take over games. And then synergies. You're hoping to build a really powerful board state that you don't need to worry about drawing cards, which fighting can't do because there are no fighting Pokemon that draw cards. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is. I'm glad to see. I remember you made this list a couple months ago, but it was so good to see another viable fighting list. I made the mistake of having a couple series with you when you were playing this list, I think I got absolutely obliterated. And my surprise is that I'm not a huge fighting enjoyer, so it's surprising for me to see the type with the least draw power have a setup board on turn 3 every game. It seems like the way that you built it was very consistent, and you almost always get your stage 2s going, and then and in a way it's similar to grass where it can play from the board. And so once the stage 2s like Colossal and Garganacl are set up, there's really not a lot opponents can do outside of maybe a Hex Maniac, but it's a threatening deck for sure, and very good against decks that I like to play that are have one tanky Pokemon and trying to disrupt and play a weird kind of game. This deck just demolishes those. So every time I see this, I shudder a little bit after you bopped my tanky metal deck. But yeah, it's a great deck, and I'm glad you made it. It's cool to see more fighting options pop up.
Yeah, and I'm glad other people are getting results with it. Usually, what we see in GLC is like someone has a deck idea and they do really well with their deck because they've put it together. They know what the deck needs to do. They know what cards to search at the appropriate moments because that's their baby, you know? But, Evan Wiki, who we mentioned getting fourth place in the tournament, he's messaged me a couple times and told me how well he's been doing with the list at his locals. I think he went 4-0 and 1 with it at a time. Other people have told me they've gone 2-1, 3-1, which is respectable for fighting since fighting doesn't get a lot of love. So, I don't hear a lot of the bad. Obviously, there are going to be times when fighting can't do its thing. So if you are not doing the bad, let me know. But I think this list is strong. I think this list is powerful. I think this list takes advantage of what fighting is good at, which is having 7 cards at the beginning of the game and then being able to use those 7 cards to make a board. It's not going to have big hands. It's not going to have strong comeback potential. You're basically just trying to punch your opponent in the face. Like you're like Mike Tyson. Like you're just taking a couple blows early, and you're going to come in with haymakers. All right, you're going to have to bite some ears off sometimes. All right, it's just going to happen. Um, but that's what this list does. You don't care about drawing if your board state can do everything in and of itself. That's what this idea was. I think that's why it's been semi successful. And I would 100% play this in a tournament tomorrow, but I'm crazy and I would play fighting in a tournament.
I think fighting in a tournament is a little bit crazy,
Well, that's okay. I mean, look at this
but
mustache.
respect.
All right, the last fighting build we're going to talk about, and then we'll talk about what fighting needs to do better before we jump into fire, and a little bit about fairy here at the end. But man, this is an earthquake list. A lot of people love earthquake. I am not an earthquake enjoyer. So I don't know if that's going to play into how I talk about the list a little bit. But basically, there are a couple of fighting Pokemon that have pretty powerful, low costed attacks. And they do big damage, but they also have a little bit of a recoil effect to the bench where they're putting 10 damage counters, 20 damage counters on their own bench. Now, the okay thing is that a couple of Pokemon synergize pretty well with that. So your Earthquakers, which again, that's the name of the attack that does big damage, then damage to the bench, which hence the deck name. You've got Donphan, which does 120 for only 1 energy, but it's also going to put 20 damage on each of your bench Pokemon. Wishcash is the same thing. It's 140, and then it puts 20 damage on your bench. I think there's another one. I don't know if it sees a lot of play anymore, but those are the big two that most people play. Then you see people run cards like Powerful Rage Steelix, which does 20 more damage for each damage counter on it, which is pretty cool. Like it gets more powerful as you're damaging it. And then you've got the Galarian Runarigus, which basically says you can put 2 damage counters for each damage counter on it onto your opponent's Pokemon for a double colorless energy cost. So synergies, but you are like hurting yourself as you go about this. And then you don't have any form of energy acceleration really outside of Raihan. So these lists can sometimes get bogged down. They're pretty prone to hand disruption. And then if you don't have Machoke, which the list I picked here is not running Machoke, you don't have Machoke, you're just losing to spread decks. So it can be tough. It can be tough going for these lists. I don't know. Weeder, what are your thoughts on Earthquake?
I'm with you. I mean, I like the approach that Squidman took here. Actually playing the Sky Pillar in case of a spread deck, but I mean, it's so easily removable. It's just there's a lot of feels bad cards in fighting. If you're gonna play damage pump, well, I mean, it might be great for one turn, but you just lost a card. Now you're down one card. You have no way to get another card back in its spot. And I think that's fighting's biggest problem, obviously, is that you can't do cheeky, cute builds because it cannot refill its hand.
Yeah.
So you play a card like Gutsy Pickaxe, and you hit an energy, that's great, but now you're down a card. And play Grant, you remove 2 cards from your hand and do some more damage, that's great. Now you're down 2 more cards. Personally, I've played a lot of Earthquake. I really tried really hard to make my own version of Earthquake work. I tried many different variants. I tried item builds, not item builds, and or sometimes, and when it does, it's great. It feels fun, but it's not consistent, and that's the main problem with it.
Yeah, and I mean that's true of all fighting decks, but again, I feel like the earthquakes doing a little bit of collateral damage to themselves is pretty tough because one of the things that fighting does have going for it is it can punch hard and it's got some like tankier Pokemon involved in it too. Like you're going to see a lot of 130 HP basics, 160 HP stage twos, so they're going to be able to tank hits. And then if you take a little bit of that away, then it loses a little bit of its viability to a certain degree. So I wish and I hope that Earthquake builds get a little bit better. It's gotten to the point where Earthquake is no longer featured on the Tricky Gem website, which is a little sad. Yeah, at least the last time I checked, it wasn't up there. If there is a list up there, I'd love to see. I think they've replaced it with Fight Guys, which is more of a Haymaker style, 1 energy attachment, big energy or big damage punching dudes. But yeah, Earthquake. I wish it was good. I hope it's good, and I hope that there's a card in the future that makes it good. We'll stop there. Well, Weeder, we've gone through the 3 playable fighting lists, at least in my opinion. What does fighting need to jump up a tier? What does fighting need to do to compete with the better decks in Gym Leader Challenge?
Doesn't need a lot, honestly. If you give it an Octillery, or what's the fighting version of Octillery? Graplocked.
Hmm.
You give it a Graplocked that drew to 4 or 5. Fighting would be S tier in my opinion. It hits for so much weakness. It's got some really good support Pokemon that you mentioned already. All it's lacking is the draw. I don't think. I mean, it's got Karina, which any type would love to have. It's got so many interesting options. It's got a lot of good basic attackers, a lot of good stage ones, a lot of good stage twos. So it doesn't need a lot, but apparently it is asking a lot for Big Pete to print a draw support Pokemon for fighting.
Yeah, that's really all it needs. And people we talked about earlier, people want this clay doll. It got reprinted in Celebration, so I'm going to call it from Celebrations, but it's from an earlier set. Put 2 cards, draw up to 6. Really powerful. I think again, I'm obviously coming from a situation where I want fighting to be one of the better decks, but I think it would be okay to unban it. Everyone else is against me, so I've got to be wrong, is what I'm gonna say. Everyone's like, if you unban that clay doll, it's gonna be broken. I'm like, you know what? I don't know how it goes from being
Yeah.
F tier to S tier all of a sudden, but okay. But it just needs a draw. Like, give me a trade ability. Like, if it's discard 1, draw 2, still great. I would take that in a heartbeat because there's one point in a game where I'm just 1 card away from being able to get out of the situation that I'm in. So give fighting some draw. It's up there. It will move up there. Depending on how good the draw is, it'll be fine. I think you could even play into some of the cool characteristics of fighting where it's like, hey, put a damage counter on this Pokemon and then draw a card. Like even something like that would be pretty cool. And then maybe that Pokemon does like X more damage for the damage counters on it. Like basically like Dodrio that got printed for colorless would have been a pretty cool card in fighting. And I think it would have fit the type pretty well.
Yeah, that's actually a great stylistic draw Pokemon for fighting. Now, you mentioned F tier to S tier. Let me give you a counterpoint to that.
Sure.
Colorless pre Lost Origins was very, very mediocre to not good.
Mhm.
And all it took was that one attacker, and that launched it into S tier forever. I don't think it will. Given what fighting has, all of the one energy attackers, all of the great support Pokemon, Archeops. Imagine Hitmonbros with the draw engine. You could do so much. I think it really would go straight to S tier. 3, hitting for weakness is a big deal in GLC,
Mhm.
and hitting the current best type for weakness, in addition to Dark and Lightning, two other good types, it would be pretty crazy.
Yeah, you know what? But if any type maybe deserves it, it's fighting. Can we not just let fighting be good for once? That's where I'm at. Everyone's like, "Nah, don't print the clay doll. We're worried about how much cards it would draw." Colorless gets to draw cards. Let's complain about fighting for once. Let's, everyone. If a year from now we're like, "Man, fighting is oppressive," I'll just look back and smile and be like, "We've arrived. We did it. Here we are."
You'll have to show us on stream one day how good it will be with Claydol.
Yeah, Costella's done some testing with it, and he says it's busted. Now, the other problem I always have is Costella is an amazing player. So Costella has won, the Async League with fighting. So like he's winning without a draw engine. Give him a draw engine, and all of a sudden now he's just winning every game, right? Like I want to give like little Timmy fighting without Claydol, and then little Timmy fighting with Claydol, and to show you that like it's just like one tier up in little Timmy's hands. Not a problem. Not a problem. Well, all right, Weeder, we're getting to your type then. So fighting, we're done with. Give it some draw power, and we'll be happy. But let's move on to fire.
I actually didn't like Fire for the longest time. I don't know, I didn't understand it, or I didn't really give it the attention that it needed. I think Fire's a very interesting type. It has, like Fighting, it has a lot of interesting support Pokemon. It has plenty of draw power, but it's just lacking something. I don't know what it's lacking. I mean, I gave a couple of options later on, but yeah, to go through some of the main or some of the best Pokemon, I put Charizard in Magcargo here. Charizard doubles all of your basic fire energy in play, which Charizard is the lifeblood of fire. I've yet to see a good fire build without Pokemon Go Charizard. Even Fire Mill requires it. All the best fire decks have always used it. It's also very tanky. It's got 170 HP, which is a lot. Makes it hard to gust and knock out. And in a pinch, you're attacking with it for 170 damage for 2 energy. So it's all around fantastic card. Its best buddy is Magcargo with a smooth over ability, so you can pick one card from your deck and put it on top of your deck. And that seems to me insanely busted in a singleton format. And so I put those two to make together to make my fire deck, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But I think those are the two best Pokemon in fire. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like this Charizard, like how great is it that there is a very playable Charizard? There's a very playable Charizard. There's a very playable Blastoise. There's a very playable Venusaur. We've got all our Gen 1ers happy in Gym Leader Challenge because of the playability of Gen 1 starters. So Charizard's just busted. You got to play it in your fire builds. If you're not playing it, you're throwing. On top of that, Macargo, we talked about this with our water builds and some of our other decks. I think Glade came up with this point. Getting a card from your deck, like any card from your deck, is a skill that you just have to develop over time, which is one of the reasons why I think Fire can be challenging to play. Getting the right card is tough. Getting any card is good, but getting the right card for the situation, then being able to draw into it, definitely makes Fire one of the more skill intensive builds.
I agree. I think these round out the best attackers in fire, at least the basics. They're all in my build. They're all in a lot of builds. We've got Inte, which was a recent printing with the silver border there. Does 20 damage for each attached fire energy, plus 60 damage overall. So when you pair that together with Charizard, you're hitting for 180 like Snorlax, and it's also reducing damage to your entire bench and the active while it is in the active. It's actually a fantastic ability. It survives lots of hits sitting in the active, which is very valuable for Fire. Fire has essentially no tanky Pokemon. I think that may be one of the biggest problems with it, is that if you look on the screen, all the other basic attackers here that are good have 120 or less hit points. So it really struggles to survive attacks, and so this Entei, if Entei ever lives one turn, it's almost certainly a victory for Fire. I think it's an underrated part of that card. Then we've got the Chi-Yu, another recent printing. It's got Mega Fire of Envy, which is a revenge attack. If any of your Pokemon were knocked out by damage last turn, it's doing 140 damage, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's a
Mm.
solid revenge attacker and really helps in a pinch. A Fire can sometimes struggle to set up, I guess, like all setup decks can. So having a cheap revenge attacker is very nice. And then the highest high roll card that I know of is Volcanion with the Flare Starter attack. If you're going second on your first turn, you can put 3 extra energy cards into play on turn 1 going second, which is absolutely busted. It's very hard to lose if you pull that off turn 1. So big high roll card there. And then the last one, which is Heatmore with the Exciting Flame attack. It can do 180 damage to the bench if it has 6 energy attached to Heatmore, which if you have Charizard in play, all you need is 3, which is, like a Blacksmith and attach from hand, or maybe a Wishful Baton from the active back to Heatmore. So it's, as you mentioned early on in the podcast, you really need to have a way to take 2 prizes, a 2-prize threat these days, and that is Heatmore for Fire.
Yeah, these are some pretty good attackers. Obviously, conditional in a sense for all of them. Like Entei's, 60 plus 20 is a pretty reasonable rate for a hydro pumper that you would see in water builds. But the fact that it has this added ability that's not quite a bench barrier, but can definitely do some bench protecting is great because most spread attackers only do around 10 to 20 damage. So this is effectively that as long as it's in the active. The best thing about the attackers, though, is the attack names. Like I'm just looking here, like Blaze Ball, Mega Fire of Envy, High Heat Blast. Like Fire has the best names when it comes to attacking. Unfortunately, they typically only get to attack once because, like you mentioned, HPs aren't that high. So you're investing a lot into these attackers at times. Heatmore's got 110. You've put 3 energy. I've heard tale of people putting 6 energy on it at a time to get to that 90 plus 180. Samakis has told me he's done it before, and I'm like, I believe you, but I need to see it at some point. But like investing that much into these Pokemon that are just going to get KO'd on the turn coming back is a big part of that. Then you got to go through the process of recovering that energy or finding more energy. You're not trading a lot of 2-for-1. So the fact that you mentioned Entei surviving an attack, like getting that 2-for-1 is super important because your fire attackers are going to be taking KOs. They're pretty good. At least damage output's good. They just need to survive.
Fire has great draw options. They both pair really well with Magcargo, and Magcargo is going to stack a card on top of your deck, and then you can use Delphox to draw up to 6, which is absurdly powerful, drawing up to 6. Or you can use Salazzle to Roast Reveal and discard a fire energy in your hand and draw 3 extra cards. So those are both great draw Pokemon.
Really not a lot to say. Delphox being a stage 2 is a little bit difficult. Salazzle discarding an energy isn't that big of a cost at times because you do have like Raihan and Mela. There's Magma Basin. So there's lots of ways for fire to get energy out of the discard pile and either back on the battlefield or back into your hand because Fire Crystal and Fisherman also exist. But it's just the bench, right? Like we've already talked about, you need Charizard, you need Macargo. So you've got 2 spots in every fire list dedicated to those 2. Well, now you're throwing a third option, Delphox and Salazzle. And then even more lists are like, hey, you know what? Let's throw in Embor. And now you've got a bench that has 4 support Pokemon and now you've got to pivot two attackers. Just like, man, one Parallel City, one Avery, you are doomed.
So true. That's a really good point. And I think we'll see that in the next slide. But that is, in my opinion, Fire's biggest weakness. Parallel City is very difficult to deal with if you're trying to play all these great support Pokemon. Yeah, you pulled up my baby, played, at this point, hundreds of games with this deck. Uh, and it's kind of a weird one. Whenever you look at it, it looks a little bit different from a lot of lists because it's very item draw intensive. And all of the supporters are draw forward, save for Tate and Liza. So take you over the high points of the deck. I'm playing Charizard, of course, Magcargo. And when I was building this deck, my personal experience with Fire is that I always had trouble getting Magcargo, Salazzle, and Charizard all set up and still attacking. I think it's kind of hard to do.
Mhm.
So I attempted, the main purpose of this build is to be able to use Magcargo without a draw Pokemon. So you want to get Magcargo set up and then always pick the right card. And it's easier to pick the right card when you can pick it on the turn that you're going to use it. I think a lot of people, when they play Fire, they're trying to pick their card for the next turn, and that's very difficult to do. No one can see the future. GLC, the singleton format, you can generally predict fairly well what your opponent might do, but picking exactly what they're going to do is very hard. So this version of Fire lets you almost always, when you have Magcargo up, lets you pick for the current turn the right card that you need. And that could be Blacksmith, very important card, Mela, Welder. Fire has so many good energy acceleration supporters. That's really how it functions. And so that's what I built the deck around. The namesake of the deck is Arcanine. It's, from the video games, it has the attack extreme speed. And so as an item-based deck with some turbo angles to it, like Battle VIP Pass and Volcanian's Flare Starter attack, it can be a turbo deck sometimes. So I went with that as the name because Arcanine, I think Arcanine is the perfect addition to a turbo style deck. It can take knockouts. If you plan your turns effectively, 120 damage, the Grand Flames attack, which is attaching energy from your discard to one of your bench Pokemon. It's not doing a lot of damage, but if you sequence things properly and sequence your attackers, which isn't too hard to do, you can almost always take a knockout with Arcanine. And that sets up your next attacker, a lot of times Heatmore or Entei, so it's a very powerful card once you get it going.
Yeah, and this list is super sweet because, like you mentioned, it's not relying on those draw Pokemon. Like Pokestop here is the perfect way to go about a Magcargo turn. Put an item on top that you might need. Oftentimes, you need to get that Charizard up and running ASAP. You can put rare candy on top, get it with Pokestop. Hopefully, you don't also mill over the Charizard if it's not in your hand. But it does have a little bit of high rolling to it at times. But a skilled player is going to navigate those situations to a certain degree. You got ton of recovery. You've got tons of way to get energy in play. You have explosive starts. You have ways to kind of get you back into the game when things go poorly, especially with that heat more that can take 2 KOs in a turn. I mean, it's just got everything you'd want in a GLC deck, and it's really going to reward smart play, tight play, good piloting.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Um, Pokestop's kind of a controversial card in GLC because it's so supporter intensive and you don't have four of everything. So I think that it probably deserves its entire own podcast. But Pokestop, even if it's discarding two good cards, it's really not the end of the world.
Mhm.
Uh, Getting deeper in your deck is very important. and Pokestop helps to do that. Helps you operate under ability lock, helps you get out of bad starts. It helps you get into Charizard or, so many other things. So it's a great card.
Yeah, and sometimes it forces your opponent to make a bad play. Like whenever you see your opponent using Pokestop in a desperation attempt, you're like, "Cool, we're in a good spot." It can definitely be that double-edged blade. I've lost using my opponent's Pokestop so hard before. So my rule is I got to think about it too now when I'm playing. Don't use your opponent's Pokestop unless your deck is made to take advantage of Pokestop. Saying it now. Saying it now.
Listen, if it's green, you got to click it.
The other thing that's really cool, or at least has come up a lot recently, is people are hating on Welder. I've seen so many people hating on Welder
Uh,
recently. Attach 2 energy to a Pokemon and draw 3 cards. Seems so good. And it seems so good even if it's only 1 energy. Like if you were just be like, hey, yeah, Raihan is attached an energy, draw 3 cards in fighting, I'd be like, I am playing that right now. So the fact that people are like, nah, I don't get to attach 2 energies with water often enough. It's not good enough. I just don't see it. The card just seems so good to me.
Fantastic card. It works perfectly with Mecargo. It works perfectly with Charizard. Even like you said, 1 energy is 2 with Charizard. A lot of times you can draw into another energy using Welder, so you've got 2 attachments per turn. Throw in Magma Basin, and that's 3. I mean, you don't want to talk about turbo decks or being aggro. A turn 1 Entei is probably game winning.
Mhm.
So it adds a lot of pop to the deck, and I couldn't imagine playing fire without it, unless it's like a fire mill maybe something like that. But yeah, I love it. I think it's a great card.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you for building it so that people can now win with fire. All right, well, talk us through this second list too, Weeder. So we're moving on from extreme speed. I believe this is a fire mill list.
Yes, this is SBO's fire list from the Discord. Great fire mill player reports to winning locals with fire mill, and this is very different from Mahone's fire list. I think Mahone kind of made fire mill popular with a stream way back in the day, and it had a really cool build for it with, oh, I'm blanking on the name,
Mhm.
Embor and Charizard and Delphox. So this is a really interesting version of it without most of those Pokemon. It looks a little bit like standard fire, but with some millers. So you've got Welder in here, Blacksmith, Magma Basin, all for energy acceleration, and then some other really cool cards. It almost honestly looks similar to Extreme Speed. It's got Wishful Baton. It's got a lot of item cards. But yeah, this is a very unique take on Fire Mill, and it looks very effective to me. Just gonna mention the main millers in the deck, which uh, Moltres will mill 1 card from your opponent's deck from the top per fire energy attached to it, and Charizard doubling that means you can potentially mill a lot in one go. The main downside of Moltres is it will discard all of the fire energies attached to it after the attack. So thank goodness you have 100-foot Flame Scorch, which has the same attack without the discard side effects. So an ideal scenario might be counter catching your opponent into something that they can't retreat, trapping a Pokemon, and then milling, you can mill 10, 12, 18, 20 cards in a go if you're really set up. And there's a good chance that you're going to mill some resources they need to actually get that trapped Pokemon out of the active. So it's a really effective strategy. I see the counter catcher, and there's actually no Guzma, which is an interesting, to me, very interesting aspect of this list.
Yeah, that is interesting. Guzma is one of the first cards I typically stick in a deck. Just having that, ability to switch not only my own Pokemon but my opponent's Pokemon to put them in a bad spot seems pretty useful. But SBO has obviously opted against that. But also, like, it's got Lieutenant Search here, so like, maybe it doesn't need Guzma if it can just like Surge into Blacksmith into Welder, attach 1,000 energy and mill you. Like maybe it just doesn't need to do that. It does play Escape Rope, so it's got at least one. It's not playing Boss. It does have Counter Catcher. I'm interested to see maybe how Luxurious Cape on a Centiskorch would play out because you don't really mind giving up prizes in this deck. So maybe, like the two prizes can kind of be mitigated by the fact that you get to mill them twice with your Centiskorch. Um, just something I'm thinking about looking at the list because I haven't played Mill in a while. I'm one of those people that saw Mahone's video, whenever it was printed. I was new to GLC, saw his video, and I was like, I gotta play Fire Mill because again, there's an old retro deck that did kind of similar things to this, but not quite the same. So I played it a couple times, realized that my opponents weren't going to have any fun, decided against playing it ever again. But I got all the cards over here. Might be time to bust them out. This is maybe giving me some inspiration to do it.
Yeah, Fire Mill certainly will discard your opponent's cards, and it might also discard all of your friends. So careful playing Fire Mill at locals.
Yeah. Well, all right. List 3 here. Talk us through it.
List 3, we got. I felt like we couldn't do a Fire podcast in any form without mentioning the OG Fire King and Xeno. So Xeno used to play this deck back when I started GLC a couple years ago, and for the life of me, could never play this deck well. But I repeatedly watched him win tournaments with it, and then I watched Sarmakis win a tournament with this exact same deck. It's very effective. It's just hard to play, and it's got a lot of the same cast of characters as my version of Fire, just without. It's more supporter heavy, and it's got Salazzle in there as well as the draw engine. But I remember watching. I don't remember the exact time frame, but again, shortly after I started GLC, Xeno and Mahone did this uh, show match, I guess you could call it, in the Tricky Gym Discord, where they would do repeated best of threes over who was better with lightning or fire, and they were always great games. They were fun to watch, and I think they had some money on it. They had some sort of bet going on with it, and I believe Mahone took him down in a best of 3 of best of threes, but they were all super close games and really fun to watch. That was a cool time in GLC for sure. So this deck always takes me back to that.
Yeah. Xeno, again, one of the reasons why Fire Snipe has kind of become a thing. I think kind of one of the last things he did before he drifted away from, being as visual as he used to be was, the new Moltres got printed in, I think it was 151. And he was like, yeah, there's a Fire Snipe list that's pretty good. And he started putting some lists together. And then, I think a couple of us piggybacked off of it. I made a YouTube video about the Fire Snipe. I think I was playing against you, if I wasn't mistaken. You were playing Dark that day. And got to showcase that deck. And that was definitely off of Xeno's back, all the hard work that he had done with the list. So he is definitely a Fire champion. Hope to see him out there again. We probably need an online client for a lot of people that used to play GLC and used to do awesome lists to come back to us. I'm thinking Yoshi Tracker and Grass, like to see those sort of players maybe come back and hang out with us again. An online client would be great, but we won't beat a dead horse and keep talking about the lack of that. We've got webcam now, and let's praise webcam for what it is.
I wish I could say that Twin Leaf GLC was coming soon, but it is. You don't realize it when you talk about it, maybe, unless you stop to think. There are about 13 or 14 years of expanded cards at this point. That is a lot of Pokemon cards. That might be 10, 12, 13,000 Pokemon cards.
Oh yeah.
So it's a lot. It's a lot of work. We're working on wrapping up standard, and I'm working on retro. So uh, just going through a few sets in the base set. Retro is time intensive. So I wish GLC were coming soon, but we might have an online client soon. So I hope everybody's looking forward to that.
Oh yeah. I know I am. And this same kind of thing, the thing you're mentioning now, kind of happened to Magic too, because they made a new online client, Magic Arena, and they basically said we got standard, we don't have anything else because they've got such a backlog of cards too, and so just waiting on them to get even the next format on there. has taken a couple years now. So, you know,
Mhm.
we're be patient for GLC. Everyone is what we're getting at. Fortunately, we have this little stopgap in webcam GLC, and there's tabletop sins to play too. If you are really craving that itch and you don't have a webcam, you can still get it in. So that's nice. There's options. Not the best options, but there's options.
Sure.
Well, Weeder, fire. What does fire need to jump up a tier?
It needs some. It needs to boost to morale. It needs people. Fire just needs people to believe in it. All the tools are there. Sometimes, sometimes you're feeling down, and all you need is a friendly gesture, a pat on the back to feel better about yourself. But fire, I personally think fire is pretty good.
Mhm.
It's not colorless, but it's just as good as a bunch of other types to me. I mean, I have a positive win rate against water of all things, so it's there. But I think it's lacking maybe two things. It might be lacking a consistency supporter, something like Irida. Irida is what absolutely broke um, Kyogre, Amazing Rare Kyogre. It it does too much. It grabbing a rare candy and a Blastoise or a rare candy and Teleon or whatever you need is it's so bonkers. Fighting has Karina and water has Irida. So a card like that would be really beneficial to make Charizard more consistent. And beyond that, someone mentioned this in the Discord the other day, and I never considered it before, but it's so accurate. You mentioned how Fire has bench space issues and Avery's a big problem, Parallel City's a big problem. Well, if Fire had some roll compression in its support Pokemon, like Psychic has with Gallade, then I think it would see a huge improvement pretty rapidly. Gallade has a Buddy Catch, which is one of the best abilities in the game. It's tanky, reasonably tanky with 160 HP. It's got also a great attack for 160 damage, and it's also an energy accelerator by passing energy to the bench. So that's a lot of really good stuff in one roll. And then when you include the draw support that Curlia, the middle evolution from that line, provides, that's a really good and really compressed support Pokemon. So if Fire could take Charizard and Salazzle and put them together, it would be, that would be very strong. So I think those are the main two things that Fire could use.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we'll get like a full cycle of like Irida type cards because you mentioned Karina already exists. There's Irida. Are we gonna get the psychic version of this, which would be busted? Are we gonna get the fire version of this at some point? Like that would be cool. Like if maybe they made a GLC printed set where it just had all of the gym leaders had their unique, Irida type card. Um, that means they'd have to give me fighting auxiliary too. But anyway,
They give every type auxiliary.
yeah, if every type had auxiliary, we would be fine. Yeah, roll compression seems key. When you brought that up, I was like, you know what? That's what it is. Just like get something off the bench. Give me space to do something else, and that would be pretty cool. Obviously, I'd love to see every type have a bench barrier too. I don't know if that really helps fighting or fire very much because Entei is pretty good at that same role. But having bench barrier in every type would be something I would love to see too. I think it also just needs another basic attacker that's good. I really think that if it had a basic that did 180, like so many of the other types have, you would see maybe a different fire game plan going on because like Snorlax does 180. There's a couple of water Pokemon that do 180. Like even if it did like 160, Chiyu is 140 base damage after a KO. So like just give me like conditional 160. It can cost 3 energy. It can have some other downside too. Maybe it has to discard all the energy or whatever. But if I think it had a basic that it could recur and just smack, it would be fine. Heatmore takes too much to be that for fire. Inte takes a lot to be that for fire because for 3 energy, it's only hitting 120 still. So I just want a big basic attacker for fire that can plow down Snorlaxes. And I think that that would be something too that would help fire out tremendously.
I'm right there with you. I think that's a very accurate assessment as well. They printed uh, Water got Walking Wake, Psychic got Latios,
Mhm.
uh, Colorless got Snorlax. Probably missing something. Grass got a Revenge KO. How much does it do?
I think it's
160?
160. Fighting's getting okie dokie.
Yeah, so they seem to be printing a lot of basic attackers and spreading the love around to different types. So hey, maybe maybe we'll get something in fire soon. Hopefully Entei wasn't that Pokemon.
Yep. Hopefully there's something better coming. Well, all right. Fairy disclaimer time. Guys, fairy is not a type anymore. It is no longer being printed in the card pool. It is fun. If you enjoy playing it, you will not win very many games with it. So if you are looking to get into Gym Leader Challenge and you are looking to play Fairy and you're looking to win, it's probably not going to happen. Now, if you're looking to play Fairy and have a good time, you can still do that. You might just lose a lot. If losing is, something you're okay with, play Fairy, but it's not getting any more support. Fairy energy has rotated. It is not in your best interest to get attached to any fairy Pokemon. No matter how much you love them, they will never be better than they are now. So I've said the 2 cents that we need to say. Let's talk about the two builds that people still play today. And a couple of different cards that are pretty important in Fairy. Would you say so? I guess before we move on, Weeder, would you say that Fairy is a good idea to play? You're with me too, right? Don't play Fairy.
Yeah, I'm totally. I'm going to say this, and then I'm gonna contradict myself. But Fairy is terrible. It leads to a lot of feels bads when you play it. It can be frustrating, but at the same time, it's got so many cool abilities. And if it ever got more Pokemon, which it won't, it could be really good. But I had fun playing against you on stream the other, what was that, last week or two
Yeah.
weeks ago or something? I
Mhm.
thought that was pretty enjoyable, even though I lost. Now, I wouldn't want to take it to a tournament and lose a lot, but every now and then it's fun to play. I might play against my son with it since it's lower power level. Yeah, but other than that, I don't want to play it.
Yeah. It's got super cool abilities, but again, it's never going to be better. That's the problem. It's never getting more printings. So again, don't get your hopes up that they're going to be printings. Don't listen to people out there telling you, "Oh yeah, they might do it." They're not. They're not going to do it. There are no more fairies. They're psychic Pokemon now. Play your favorite fairy Pokemon as psychic types. Just wait a couple years. I'm sure that they'll print them. I know that's a lot to ask. Until then, you can get by playing these cards. But again, you might be sad sometimes.
I've got
Let's.
I've got one more thing to add to this. Everyone wants to be the one to crack a type, right?
Mhm.
Well, we have the guy who created Lost Zone Psychic is Tyler Matthews, and he's a worlds competitor 2 years in a row. And he top forward regional not very long ago. All of his decks, he makes them. They're even his standard decks. He's a deck builder. They're all unique. They're all crazy and very good. He tried Fairy back when PTCGO was around, and I played against his Fairy build sometimes, and it just felt like it had no chance of winning at all. And he's one of the best players in the world. So if you're thinking about playing Fairy and you feel like you're gonna crack it, just go into it knowing that one of the best deck builders on Earth couldn't even get close.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Fairies for fun. And let's get into it. It's got some neat cards. So we'll talk about it. I will tell you how excited I am about them. But in the back of your head, just imagine my voice saying, "Don't do it. Don't do it." And here they are. So Fairy is a little bit like baby grass. I kind of love this analogy because it has so many of these cool traits that they're just not as good as what grass is doing. So there's the Shinotic here, which is basically Grottle in grass, which lets you search your deck for a fairy Pokemon. Grottle does grass, Shinotic does fairy, and they both have 100 HPs, 2 retreats. There's a lot of similarities between the two. So having this card's pretty sweet. Lets you get out your fairy Pokemon relatively early if you get it into play. Not level ball searchable, but other ways to get it, obviously. Then where grass has Roserade, which again evolves, and when you evolve it, you can go get any card from your deck. Whimsicott has the same ability, Prow, but it's even better because it has free retreat. So Whimsicott is a better Roserade. Just the rest of the fairy cards are bad.
Accurate.
Then you got some kind of fun energy acceleration, is what I'm going to call it. So there's this Florges here, which makes each of your Pokemon's attacks cost less, like one fairy less. And then you have a Togekiss here, which is really sweet. It can evolve the turn that you have it. So if you evolved Togepi into Togetic, you can just go ahead and evolve straight into Togekiss because of its Delta trait. And then when you evolve it, you can look at the top 8 cards and you can choose any basic energy cards that you find there and attach them to your Pokemon in any way. So you can high roll a lot of energy with this. You can stack your deck if you're really looking to get creative. And then you have this Clefable that does 10 plus 30 more damage for each of your Pokemon that has fairy energy. So if you go Togekiss, you attach your energy into different places, you can get this Clefable to do pretty decent amount of damage. And one of the things that Fairy is really lacking, besides printings, is Pokemon that can do big damage.
Yeah, Togekiss and Florges make Fairy feel fun. Those are good, fun cards, and I appreciate that they exist.
Yeah, a lot of fun interactions, a lot of fun synergies within the type. Um, Here are your attackers, and this is where things go a little south for Fairy. Again, great support Pokemon that we've already seen. Tapu Fini is 3 energy for 100 damage, and then your opponent's active is Confuse. Not a great rate. This is your second best attacker in Fairy. Then Xerneas, who has a lead ability, so you're searching your deck for any supporter, which can be a good starter. For 3 energy, does 130, but it can't use Bright Horns next turn. So you can't like attack twice to take 2 KOs consecutively without switching out Xerneas here. So um rough. Rough on Xerneas being again probably the best fairy attacker, at least the most damage. What fairy builds typically rely a lot on is that their opponents are playing good cards. So if their opponents are playing good cards, guess what? Mimikyu with a copycat ability gets better. So again, you're really, really hoping that your opponent is playing good cards so that you can respond with a Mimikyu. And again, Mimikyu might actually be the best attacker because everyone else is just playing better cards than you. And then to kind of close out the cards in Fairy that are pretty good, there's this Rabombi, which is pretty fun. Free retreat, only 60 HP. But whenever your opponent plays a supporter, you prevent all effects of that card done to your fairy Pokemon. So it blocks Guzma. I think it blocks Hex. It's a pretty interesting card. It gets, plopped down on the bench, and then, you kind of just protect what you have going on. And Rabombi is really unique in that way. It gets used playing a lot of control builds. And of course, there's a bench barrier. Thank goodness there's a bench barrier. Draw cards for Fairy, not super great. There's like a Cleffa that you like flip a coin to draw 6 cards, or like to draw up to 6, or to shuffle draw 6. So you're really reliant on a lot of coin flipping in those lists. I don't think there's any straight draw abilities. Whimsicott is usually your best go at it. Um, Here are some others. Yeah, here's the Cleffa. So it's and then draw 6 cards if you flip a coin. So shuffle your hand into your deck and then draw 6 cards. Surpluff is just straight draw a card. If this is your active, you can draw another. And then Florges here lets you get an item card back. So these are your card advantage engines. Not great, but passable. Fighting would be happy to have any one of these. And those are the fairy cards that matter. And then these are the fairy decks that matter. There's 2 of them. This is Control, and I'm going to use Zach's list, Z-Man, who was on stream with us last week. Basically the idea is you're a doll control deck. So you're running Lily's Pokédoll and Robo Substitute to kind of keep in the active to absorb damage while denying your opponent's prizes. You've got that Rabombi to protect what you've got going on your bench. You're trying to mill your opponent out and stall the game. So you've got Counter Catcher here, Guzma as ways to kind of force your opponents to exhaust their switch cards and get you to a point of the game where they're no longer able to retreat while they're drawing cards. And then you're trying to have big turns where you Lieutenant Surge into a card to recover you some things that you'll need while using a card like Team Rocket's Handiwork to mill them, or you might be using cards to deny them energy like Team Flare Grunt as well. So it's not unique as a control deck because there are other control decks that are doing similar things. But the fact that it has Rabombi to protect against a Guzma or a boss is pretty interesting. And that's kind of what lets these builds still kind of exist. I think that this is probably the best fairy list because this list is maybe going to have a better chance at winning the game. It's just not going to happen in 40 minutes. So if there's ever a timer, you will never, ever, ever win. Probably. I'm sure someone has done it, but the timer is this deck's biggest opponent. And also the fact that it has no cards that are good.
You will win if your opponent would rather watch paint dry for those 40 minutes
Yeah.
and walk away from the table. They could do that.
Yeah. Me and a couple buddies, we drove an hour down to Augusta to go and play at the GLC tournament down there. And I remember there was a fairy control opponent. And before the game started, he asked his opponents if they wanted to draw. And of course, we had driven an hour. So my friend, who was relatively new to the format, was like, yeah, let's play. Like, I want to play. Like, my friends are playing. I can't go home anyway. Let's play. So they ended up playing, and I have never seen my friend sadder. He was just like sitting there, like, huh, huh. And then after 40 minutes, like, no one won the game. They drew, and we just went home. Like, it was very sad. I think if this deck didn't exist, I would look more positively on fairy players as a whole. I respect
Yes.
turbo fairy players, but when someone tells me they play fairy, I think of this deck immediately, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to play, man.
I'd be curious to know the psychology behind fairy stall players.
I mean, if you really love the type, like you're making other people hate the type. I don't know. You're not spreading the love, I guess, is with this deck. So, if you're interested in letting your opponents enjoy the game, or if you're interested in trying to take sick prizes, this is where I think you're going to be at. This is the Turbo Fairy deck, made by Watto, who will notice that I mentioned in last episode for his Dusk Buddies build. But this is his take on it. Again, it's got those big energy plays with Togekiss. You're using Xerneas and Tapu Fini to actually try to take prizes. Mimikyu, still your best attacker. And then you have that Clefable that can hit big damage too. You need a lot of help. You need to get going quickly. It's a turbo deck for a reason. You're looking to get Togekiss or Florges out really, really early. You've got some disruption cards like Parallel City and Reset Stamp to kind of set your opponent back. You've got Devolution Spray that works immediately with Togekiss, so you can devolve it and then evolve it and do those 8 cards energy attachments all over again because of its Delta Trait ability. Diantha, which is a great, great, great recovery card. It might be like the best card in Fairy in terms of support, just because if your Fairy Pokemon was knocked out, you can get 2 cards back from your discard pile. So it's a very unique card in that factor. The fact that it's Fairy Pokemon is doing it a lot of hate at this moment. But it's a list that's trying to win. It just falls short. Like Xerneas maxes out at 130. You've got a muscle band in your list. 150 is the number that you're going to be hitting often, unless your Mimikyu can do a retaliate attack or some big attack as a return attack. It's tough. I've played this list too. I played it into dark as a favorable matchup. It was my first time playing the list, so I didn't like know all the ins and outs. But even having resistance was still tough. It felt really tough to play.
I do think it is hard to play. And maybe that's because it's all the attackers are so bad, but
Mhm.
I still think there are a lot of routes and a lot of angles that even Watto playing such an underpowered deck, he can still make it semi-far in tournaments with this, but he really knows how to play it. I think it's actually kind of hard to play.
Yeah, 100%. So that's Turbo Fairy, and that's the fairy type. What does fairy need? It might need to go away, in all honesty. I mean, I probably shouldn't say that, but I like the type. I like the cards. They just need to print all these cards in Psychic. Like, if they just all of a sudden were like, you know what, Fairy is gone, but we've printed all the same exact cards into Psychic, so you can still play them. Here you go. Because I don't know if having Fairy as a type and existing is great for people trying to play and have fun.
You took the words literally right out of my mouth. I was going to say it might need to go away.
No, no. Hey, great
I
minds think
think
alike.
don't be sad it's gone. Be happy that it was here at all.
Yeah. It and again, it's still playable. Like, it's not banned. Like, obviously, no matter what we just said, you can still play Fairy. So if you're playing Fairy with your friends casually, that's great. Please do that. This is a format where you can really express yourself. You can really have fun expressing yourself. Just make sure you're the type of person that can have fun doing that before you spend money on these cards. Like, I don't want anyone to leave here today being like, they told me I can still play Fairy, so I'm going to buy those cards. No, buy a real deck. If you really dive deep, I own these cards. So, like, obviously, I did buy them at some point, but don't spend your money on fairy cards, especially if you don't have a lot of money to spend on them.
I think I was about 20 decks deep before I finally broke down and bought Turbo Fairy.
Hmm.
So it takes a while,
Yeah.
but I'm glad I bought it. I'm glad I have it.
Yeah, I am not upset with my investment either. I enjoy like having it. I enjoy looking at it. I will play it from time to time. So it exists. This was the last ever deck I played on PTCGO. This was my fairy farewell to PTCGO. So it was fun that this was the last thing I got to say. And then it was kind of like, well, hey, now fairy's gone too. Well, that leads us to deck of the week. Then we got shout outs, and then we're done, Wheatr. We've already been talking for 2.5 hours, so thank you for being with me still as we get through this. But deck of the week, hey, I had to give it to Dead Maniac Light Metal. Light Metal, there's an article about this deck that's out there. Dead Maniac put a lot of work in. His article is very well written. He put a lot of care into it. But Light Metal is a pretty interesting build of metal. He does pretty well with it. A lot of people have picked it up. I think it's in like the same little bubble that I put Elusive Feather, where like it can play well with certain people piloting it, but it does take skill and knowledge to know kind of what the lines are and when your attacks are going to take KOs, because this isn't your typical tanky big build. It's got some of those same aspects, like it's got Zamazenta in here, which is the best metal Pokemon printed, or at least the best metal attacker. But you're not getting like big hands with Reverum in this build. You're not getting the double acceleration out of Bronzong and Matang. You just have Bronzong here. So you've got Galarian Berserker to kind of boost up your attacks. Bisharp here is going to be one of your ways to take KOs along with Zacian. And then its Slicing Blade only does 100. So it's not going to be taking big KOs, but it is going to help you chip in some damage while you kind of set up the rest of your board. Metagross is pretty fun in this build since you can just kind of get it into play by drawing it off the top of your deck. And you've got a lot of kind of fun ways to do that. You can max revive it back on top of your deck. You can use switching cups to guarantee it as a top deck. And you're also playing Mallow as another way to kind of set up that draw. So Metagross comes down. It lets you draw 3 cards while just putting a stage 2 straight into play. And then Meteor Mash does 100 for 2. And then if you're not switched out, it can do another 100 on top of that. So it can hit those big 200 numbers. So it's got its routes, it's got its lines, it can take KOs. It's a fun deck.
Yeah, I watched this bits and pieces of multiple games of this deck in the big tournament we just had, and I was pretty surprised how consistently it was Had a board of Berserker and Bronzong after a return KO, and it found an attacker and took a revenge KO every time. I was kind of surprised and impressed at the same time by this deck.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. What like my initial thoughts looking at it are, hey, it doesn't hit big numbers, which I think has become more important as decks like Snorlax and Special Energy Whales have kind of appeared as top players in the meta. But this deck is just so efficient. Like, it doesn't require a lot of energy to take the KOs. A lot of its Pokemon, like Bronzor, can evolve immediately into Bronzong if it's your turn, first turn going second, which can kind of give you some explosive plays. Galarian Berserker can kind of evolve itself to a certain degree, and then Jirachi just gets you the pieces that you need, and having it as a pivot is great, and it helps you find those recovery cards. You've got Lana's Fishing Rod, Rescue Stretcher, Max Revive, Clara, all as ways to recover Pokemon and energy if you need to. So, it just goes about the game, hopefully targeting some of your opponent's smaller Pokemon to kind of get the lead, and then from there, win the game, hopefully.
Recap.
Cool. All right. Last thing we're going to say, and then we'll close out here. We got some shout outs. So, Cardboard Warriors Async League Season 2, or no, we're on Season 3 now, aren't we? Season 3 is
Season
starting.
3?
Yeah. Async League is super awesome. So, for those of you who don't know, Cardboard Warriors has their weekly tournaments. They alternate times on Wednesdays between European friendly times and North American friendly times. And then they have Saturday tournaments as well. But if you're like me and you just don't have the time to sit in front of your computer for 3 to 4 hours because maybe you're watching a kid or you've got something else going on in your life, well, hey, you can play in the Async League, which is just whenever you have time, you hop into the Cardboard Warriors Discord, you ping some people at a certain role. That role is GLC League LFG. And then if you find someone else to play, you play and you record your match. And so that way you can kind of build towards a leaderboard. At the end of the season, you play in a big kind of like at your own pace bracket where you find within a week's time, time to play your opponent and record that to move up into the bracket for your certain type. And it's just fun and it's a little casual, and you can play when you want to while also trying to earn towards a badge or to win towards a leaderboard. So,
yeah, it's lots of fun. It's also nice because the games aren't timed. There's no draw time pressure. It's laid back. People love to. It's fun because people play the decks they like, but also try hard to win. So it's a good mix of competitive and fun games. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And you're playing towards a specific type at the end of the season. So if you're someone who enjoys fighting, there aren't a lot of people that play fighting. So as long as you're pretty consistent in how you play your games, you're eventually probably going to end up at the leaderboard of a certain type, as long as you're consistent. So that's what I ended up doing with fighting. I think my record was like 8-13 with Hitmon Bros at some point. I will say I was trying to mess around with my list a little bit, but I definitely was losing a lot there at the end to have a negative win rate. But I was the only one playing fighting, so I got the badge. Well, all right. Well, hey, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for episode 3 of the Let Loose podcast. Again, a podcast dedicated to all things dedicated to the Gym Leader Challenge format in this Pokemon TCG. Wheatr, thank you for being here with me today. It was a pleasure to talk shop with you.
Thanks for having me. It was lots of fun.
Yeah.
I think you're doing a great job. Thanks for carrying on the GLC flag.
Thanks, appreciate it. Well, all right, everyone, have a wonderful night, and we'll be back next week with